Sophie, a bright 19-year-old with dreams of becoming a nurse, vanished one cold Liverpool night. Marcus, a streetwise teenager, thought he was just running errands for a local gang, until he realized the horrors he was helping create. And then there was the man they only knew as the Shadow, the unseen mastermind, whose name no one dared speak. This is the story of how silence, fear, and a dark empire ruled the streets of Merseyside, and how a single act of courage began to unravel it all. For years the city of Merseyside carried a quiet darkness that many refused to see. Late at night, alleyways and streets near the docks seemed empty, but the emptiness was deceiving. Behind the closed doors of old buildings, in the shadows of abandoned warehouses, a hidden network of violence operated without anyone noticing. For most residents, the occasional news report of an assault or disappearance was shocking, but they never suspected a single, organized force was behind it. The incidents were scattered, appearing random, and for decades, authorities struggled to connect the dots. Each case seemed isolated until patterns began to emerge, faint but persistent. The gang, later known in hushed whispers as the Rape Mafia, had perfected the art of invisibility. They understood fear and silence better than any weapon. Victims were carefully chosen, isolated from witnesses, and left with a sense of helplessness that ensured they rarely spoke out. Families were threatened, friends warned, and the people who might interfere found doors slammed in their faces, or, in some cases, threats that forced them to leave the city entirely. Police investigators who tried to link assaults often hit invisible walls. Cases were filed, evidence disappeared, and witnesses recanted. It was as if the gang had the city under a spell of terror, where the only way to survive was to look the other way. In the neighborhoods where the gang operated, locals whispered about strange patterns. Women walking home late at night would suddenly notice someone following at a distance, only to disappear when the light turned on. Shopkeepers reported seeing unfamiliar faces loitering near bus stops, always watching but never speaking. Even young men avoided certain streets after dark, knowing instinctively that danger lurked unseen. It was not just the violence that kept the city in fear, it was the precision, the organization, and the knowledge that the gang had eyes everywhere. No one knew how long the group had existed, but evidence suggested it was decades. Older residents recalled unexplained disappearances in the 1990s, cases that had been dismissed as runaways or bad luck. Over time, the gang's influence spread from the hidden corners of the docks to popular nightlife areas, club districts, and even residential streets. Their reach was subtle but powerful, growing greedily like a shadow consuming the light. What made the gang so dangerous was not only their capacity for violence, but their ability to remain unseen. They did not need to boast or announce themselves. The city's fear was their reputation. Even the police, trained to spot criminal activity, found themselves struggling. Investigators were puzzled by patterns that defied logic, by victims who seemed unable or unwilling to give coherent accounts. Every lead seemed to vanish overnight. CCTV footage often showed nothing unusual, or frames were mysteriously missing. The gang was meticulous. Each crime was executed with a level of planning that made it appear accidental, random, or unsolvable. Yet, despite all this, the first whispers of resistance began. Small acts of bravery, someone finally reporting a suspicious figure, a parent refusing to ignore a missing teenager would later be the threads that investigators needed to start unraveling the network. At the time, however, Merseyside remained a city under quiet siege. Fear had become a way of life, and the shadows held secrets that no one wanted to uncover. The Rape Mafia existed in plain sight, a dark empire built on silence and threats, waiting for the first mistake that would expose it. The first crack in the silence came unexpectedly, almost by accident. For years, police had worked on cases of assaults and disappearances across Merseyside, but nothing ever connected. Each report was filed, each victim treated, yet the detectives felt an invisible wall blocking them from seeing the bigger picture. The gang had operated with such precision that their crimes appeared isolated, random, almost natural. It was as if someone had drawn a line through the city and moved along it with perfect timing, leaving fear behind but no trace. The breakthrough began with a survivor who refused to be silenced. She was terrified, aware of the risks, but she had noticed something strange near the site of her attack. A small symbol, painted or scratched on a wall, barely noticeable unless someone was looking for it. To most, it was meaningless, a mark of vandalism. But to investigators it was a clue. It was not the act of a random criminal. This was deliberate, an encoded message, left behind by someone who believed only their kind would understand it. The discovery was subtle, but it changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives began combing through old reports, searching for any mention of similar marks. Slowly, almost invisibly, a pattern emerged. The symbol appeared near locations of previous assaults, always discreet, always unnoticed by the public. It became clear that the gang was signaling, leaving a secret map in plain sight. Each mark marked a zone, a warning or a note to members. It was a silent communication system, hidden in the city, and it was a sign of something much bigger than anyone had imagined. As the symbol reappeared across different districts, investigators realized that the gang was not only organized but methodical. Each attack was planned, each movement calculated, each victim chosen carefully. This was not a crime of opportunity. The gang had rules, routines, and a hierarchy that allowed them to operate for years without detection. Fear and intimidation had kept the city silent, but the symbols revealed that the gang was confident, even daring, in their control. They believed they could operate openly, that no one would ever decipher the code. For the investigators, the discovery was both terrifying and exhilarating. It meant the gang had a structure, but it also meant they had a weakness. If they could understand the symbols, they could predict the gang's moves, identify patterns, and find the people behind the attacks. Every detail mattered: time, location, placement, and style. Slowly, the seemingly random cases began to connect, forming a picture of a network that had grown for years, feeding on fear and silence. The survivors' courage had opened the door to a dangerous world, a world that was hidden yet meticulously organized. The gang had survived for so long because nobody had dared to speak, because the victims were too afraid, because witnesses were threatened or bribed into silence. But the first crack in that wall showed the investigators that the empire of fear was not invincible. The symbols were small, almost invisible, but they carried a message. The gang could be understood, and eventually they could be stopped. It was a slow, careful process, like piecing together a puzzle in the dark. But for the first time, hope had entered the investigation. The gang's confidence had left behind a trail, a series of tiny mistakes that could unravel years of terror. The city had been quiet for too long, and now the first signs of resistance were emerging, quietly, like the faintest light breaking through a long night. The gang's power did not come from sheer numbers or violence alone. It came from control, from the streets of Merseyside to the quiet corners of its neighborhoods. The gang's enforcers ruled with a precision that kept the city in fear. They were always present but rarely seen directly. Ordinary people didn't notice them until it was too late. These enforcers were the arms of the Rape Mafia, tasked with ensuring that no one interfered with their operations. Their job was clear: eliminate threats, intimidate witnesses, and enforce obedience without hesitation. Every movement of the gang was calculated. The enforcers patrolled areas where the gang had influence, memorizing routines, learning who walked home alone, noting who asked too many questions. Even minor acts of curiosity were punished. A single word to the police could result in months of harassment or threats toward the victim's family. For those who did not comply, the consequences were far worse. People vanished from their homes, leaving behind belongings, friends, and families with no explanation. The authorities could classify them as missing, but for locals, the disappearances sent a clear warning: no one was untouchable. The enforcers themselves were a mixture of hardened criminals and younger recruits who had been trained to obey without question. They were taught the art of surveillance, how to follow targets without being noticed, and how to manipulate fear. Their presence alone created an atmosphere of tension. Residents felt watched, even when no one was around. This invisible control was more powerful than violence. It ensured that the gang's operations continued without public challenge, while police investigations struggled to find solid evidence. Some locals realized too late how deeply the enforcers had infiltrated daily life. People who tried to intervene, reporting suspicious behavior, protecting potential victims, or even speaking out against the gang faced consequences. Jobs were lost, homes were threatened, and in extreme cases, people were forced to leave the city entirely. The enforcers were a reminder that the gang's reach extended beyond just the streets where attacks occurred. It reached into the very heart of the community, shaping behavior through fear alone. The gang's control extended to coordination as well. Enforcers relayed information about potential threats or surveillance to the higher ranks of the organization. Each disappearance, each incident, and each witness report was carefully recorded and addressed. They operated with a discipline that made them more than just criminals. They were a system, a structure built to survive for decades. Even when police began to investigate, the enforcers made sure that every lead became cold. Residents soon realized that the enforcers were as much psychological as physical. Fear became a tool, as effective as any weapon. People stopped asking questions, avoided certain streets, and ignored suspicious behavior. In this way, the gang created an ecosystem of silence, one that allowed their operations to grow quietly and without challenge. The enforcers were the backbone of the rape mafia. They enforced rules that no one could see and controlled lives that no one could protect. Their existence was a chilling reminder of the gang's strategy. The strongest power is the power that cannot be seen, the fear that cannot be fought, and the threats that cannot be ignored. For years, the city lived under this invisible control, unaware of how tightly the enforcers had woven their grip over every night, every street, and every fearful step. The gang's expansion did not happen by chance. It was carefully planned, and one of their most disturbing strategies involved recruitment. Young men, often desperate or already entangled in minor crimes, became the gang's new tools. They were drawn in with promises of protection, money, and a sense of belonging. To them it seemed like joining a local group that handled petty thefts or neighborhood disputes. Few realized that their new role came with far darker responsibilities that would bind them to the gang for life. Training was subtle but effective. The recruits were introduced to routines that seemed harmless at first. Observing streets, learning the movement of local authorities, noting suspicious behavior. Gradually the tasks became darker. They were instructed on how to isolate victims, how to manipulate fear, and how to avoid leaving evidence. Each assignment built a sense of loyalty, a twisted understanding that leaving the gang was impossible. The recruits were made to believe that compliance was the only way to survive, that stepping out of line meant danger, not just for themselves, but for their families and friends. The gang's recruiters were meticulous. They studied potential recruits before approaching them, selecting individuals who were easily influenced, who carried desperation or anger that could be manipulated. Once inside, the young men became enforcers themselves, trained to obey orders without question. Their identities were gradually absorbed into the gang's system, their lives reshaped by fear and obligation. Many had dreams and aspirations before joining, but those faded under the weight of guilt and the constant reminder that their loyalty had a price. What made the recruitment process so effective was the combination of fear and enticement. Recruits were given small rewards for tasks at first, reinforcing obedience. Later they witnessed punishments for those who failed or spoke out, reinforcing the consequences of disobedience. Slowly, the recruits became both victims and perpetrators, trapped in a cycle where leaving meant danger and staying meant complicity. This duality made the gang almost impossible to infiltrate. Police officers trying to approach potential informants were met with silence, as recruits feared exposure or retribution. The gang's reach expanded not only through intimidation but through manipulation of opportunity. They exploited weaknesses in the community, troubled youths, unemployed young men, and those isolated from family support. These individuals were shaped into silent enforcers, walking the streets as part of the gang's invisible network. Each new recruit added a layer of protection to the gang, allowing operations to continue while keeping law enforcement at bay. By the time the gang had fully trained a cohort of recruits, their system was near perfect. The younger members reinforced the older hierarchy, and their loyalty was guaranteed by fear and conditioning. They became both the hands and the eyes of the gang, watching, enforcing, and ensuring that no one disrupted the criminal empire. The cycle repeated, quietly and efficiently, with every new generation further cementing the gang's power. The dark reality was that recruitment was more than expansion. It was survival. Without fresh members willing to obey without question, the gang could not have maintained its empire. Each young recruit was a thread in a web of control, a living extension of the gang's reach, and a reminder that the most dangerous weapon of all was not force, but the ability to trap others into becoming part of the system they feared. The discovery of the warehouse was a turning point in the investigation, the first physical proof that the gang's operations were far more organized than anyone had imagined. It was an old, abandoned building near the Mersey River, hidden behind overgrown fences and crumbling walls. At first glance, it seemed empty, forgotten by time and the city. But as detectives moved inside, it became clear that the space had been carefully chosen to hide secrets in plain sight. The air smelled of dust and decay, but there were signs that the gang had been there recently. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to hint at activity that the public would never see. The walls were covered in coded markings, symbols, numbers, and letters that at first appeared meaningless. Investigators soon ruled they formed a map of the gang's movements and communications. Each mark indicated a location, a date, a warning, or an instruction. It was a system that allowed members to operate across the city without direct contact. A secret network that ensured orders were followed while protecting the higher ranks. The gang had created an entire communication system based on symbols, invisible to anyone who did not know their meaning. In addition to the markings, the warehouse contained discarded items, broken electronics, clothing, and personal belongings that hinted at multiple victims. The evidence was chilling but incomplete. It suggested that the gang had used the location as a temporary base, a place to plan or review operations before disappearing into the city. The detectives understood that this warehouse was not the main hub of activity, but it was proof of an organized system that had allowed the gang to operate undetected for years. The investigators also noted the precision of the setup. Items were arranged deliberately, nothing seemed out of place. It became clear that the gang had trained members to use the warehouse efficiently, to leave no trace of their activities while maintaining access to everything they needed. The presence of coded maps and tools suggested careful planning, showing that the gang operated with a long-term strategy rather than spontaneous attacks. Every detail was considered, every action calculated. Beyond the evidence itself, the discovery of the warehouse had a psychological effect. It revealed that the gang was bold enough to keep a base within the city, confident that no one would find it. It also suggested arrogance, a belief that their system of secrecy and fear was impenetrable. For investigators, it was a message. The gang's power was enormous, but not infallible. The markings and hidden records provided the first real clues about how the network functioned, offering a chance to understand patterns that had previously seemed random. The warehouse became a central point in the investigation. Every detail was recorded, photographed, and analyzed. Patterns began to emerge. Specific symbols corresponded with certain neighborhoods, repeated sequences indicated planned attacks, and some codes revealed schedules of surveillance. It was the first time law enforcement had a window into the gang's inner workings, a glimpse into the hidden machinery that had allowed the rape mafia to control the streets. The detectives understood that, while the warehouse was just a small piece of the puzzle, it represented a critical turning point. It proved that the gang's empire was real, organized, and methodical. It showed that the rape mafia was not simply a collection of criminals acting at random. It was a system, a dark network built on fear, secrecy, and control. The discovery of the warehouse marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, one that could finally start to dismantle the empire that had thrived in the shadows for so long. As investigators began piecing together the gang's network, a disturbing pattern emerged, pointing to a single figure at the top. He was never seen in public, never approached anyone directly, and existed only through whispers and rumors in the criminal underworld. The man, known to few by an alias, seemed untouchable. Orders were never passed face to face. Messages went through layers of intermediaries, ensuring that the mastermind remained invisible. Even the most experienced detectives struggled to comprehend how one person could orchestrate such a widespread system without leaving a trace. The mastermind's influence was subtle, but absolute. He had designed a system where violence was carefully controlled, threats were routine, and fear became a currency. Victims were threatened after each attack. Witnesses were silenced with intimidation or bribes, and community members were kept compliant through a network of small punishments and warnings. Everything was planned to create the illusion of chaos, while in reality, every action served a purpose. Nothing happened by chance. The gang operated almost like a corporation. Each member had a role, each street was monitored, and every incident was recorded and analyzed by the hierarchy. The mastermind was at the center, pulling the strings, making decisions that ensured the empire would continue growing without detection. He understood human psychology and the ways people reacted to fear. His power was not in physical strength but in control, manipulation, and careful orchestration. Even seasoned criminals within the gang followed orders without question, terrified of the consequences of disobedience. Investigators found traces of his influence in unexpected ways. They began noticing patterns in reports, symbols, and locations that connected not just individual assaults, but entire networks of activity. Each thread led to another, all pointing to an organized structure that only someone with a profound understanding of fear and secrecy could maintain. The detective teams realized that this figure had spent years building an empire that thrived because the city was unwilling or too afraid to challenge it. The psychological grip of the mastermind extended beyond the gang. Local residents had been conditioned to look the other way. Shopkeepers ignored suspicious activity, neighbors did not question the disappearances of young women, and witnesses kept silent for fear of repercussions. Even law enforcement had been cautious, aware that confronting the gang could provoke retaliation or endanger vulnerable members of the community. It was a system designed to perpetuate itself, and it had done so with terrifying efficiency for years. What made the situation more alarming was the mastermind's patience. He did not act recklessly. Each decision was calculated, each attack pre-planned, and every escape carefully thought out. The gang's structure ensured that even if a lower-level member was caught, no direct link could be made to him. The organization was a fortress, with layers of protection, all designed to shield the man at the top while allowing the network to operate almost freely. Despite the fear and complexity, investigators knew that uncovering the mastermind was key. The system would crumble if the person at its core was exposed. But finding him required more than traditional methods. It required understanding the gang's psychology, analyzing patterns, and most importantly, obtaining someone willing to speak from within. The realization was both frightening and motivating. The empire's strength had always been its secrecy, but secrecy could also become its vulnerability. For the first time, there was a sense that the unseeable might be within reach. The elusive mastermind, who had remained untouchable for years, had left traces, subtle, hidden, but present. Detectives knew that patience, observation, and careful planning would be essential to bring him down, and the investigation was entering a phase where every discovery could either illuminate the network or trigger unseen dangers. The city had never felt so tense, and the shadow at the top of the gang had never seemed so close to being exposed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, someone from within the gang itself. For years the younger recruits had followed orders without question, trapped in a cycle of fear and obedience. They had witnessed crimes, carried out instructions, and lived with the knowledge that any mistake could lead to punishment or worse. But one recruit had reached a breaking point. He had seen too much, felt too guilty, and feared for his own future in a system that offered no escape. His conscience and fear collided, creating a dangerous mix that would ultimately change the course of the investigation. The recruit's decision to come forward was not sudden. It had been building over months, fueled by small mistakes, growing anxiety, and the sense that the gang's power was not as untouchable as it seemed. He had narrowly avoided being caught in a raid, and the incident made him realize that the system he had served for so long could also fail. He began keeping mental notes, remembering meeting places, coded symbols, and the identities of higher-ranking members. The information he carried was dangerous, but it was also invaluable. When he finally approached the authorities, he provided details that had been missing from every case for years. With the recruits' cooperation, investigators gained access to a hidden layer of the gang's operations. They received maps showing meeting points, schedules of surveillance, and lists of members whose names had never surfaced. The details revealed the inner workings of an organization that had seemed impossible to penetrate. It showed how the gang had communicated, how orders were passed down, and how fear was maintained across neighborhoods. Suddenly, what had seemed random became clear. Patterns emerged, and the seemingly untouchable network began to show cracks. The betrayal sent shockwaves through the gang. Members who had never doubted their hierarchy were suddenly exposed, and panic began to spread. The enforcers, trained to enforce silence and obedience, found themselves caught off guard. Raids and arrests began almost immediately, taking advantage of the intelligence provided by the insider. The gang's operations, once seamless and invisible, started to unravel in hours. The carefully constructed empire of fear and control was beginning to collapse from the inside. For investigators, the recruits' information was a turning point. It provided connections that had eluded them for years, allowing them to link assaults, missing persons, and threats across Merseyside. It also offered a glimpse into the psychology of the gang, how loyalty had been manufactured, how fear had been weaponized, and how obedience had been enforced through a combination of reward and punishment. The betrayal revealed the fragility of a system built entirely on intimidation. The young insider knew the risks. Coming forward could make him a target for retribution, but his knowledge had had a lifeline for investigators determined to dismantle the network. Every detail he shared brought law enforcement closer to the elusive leaders, the enforcers, and ultimately, the mastermind at the top. The cracks in the gang were no longer theoretical, they were real and exploitable. The recruits' courage marked the beginning of the end. For years the gang had relied on silence and fear, believing that no one would ever dare to challenge them. Now, an insider had shattered that illusion. The city that had lived under invisible control could finally hope for justice, and the empire that had thrived in shadows was starting to face the consequences of its overconfidence and the first acts of defiance from within. The final phase of the investigation began with a mix of anticipation and tension. With the insider's information, law enforcement had a roadmap into the gang's operations, but the task of capturing the mastermind remained daunting. He had spent years building layers of protection, using intermediaries to shield himself from any direct exposure. Every step taken to bring him down had to be calculated, precise, and cautious. One wrong move could alert him, allowing him to disappear into the city's shadows once again. As detectives followed the trail, they realized the mastermind had been living quietly among ordinary people, blending seamlessly into neighborhoods where no one would suspect his presence. He did not display wealth or arrogance, nor did he rely on ostentatious displays of power. Instead, his influence had always been quiet, invisible, and systemic. He had created a network where others acted on his behalf, enforcing rules, spreading fear, and ensuring that the public never saw the full extent of the crimes. Yet, even the most meticulous plans leave traces, and the investigators had finally identified enough anomalies to locate him. The arrest was the culmination of months of careful surveillance and planning. Detectives moved in swiftly, knowing that hesitation could allow him to vanish once more. The city watched in stunned silence as the man who had controlled so much from the shadows was led away in handcuffs. It was a surreal moment. Someone who had seemed untouchable, a figure responsible for years of terror, was finally caught. For the first time, victims and witnesses felt a glimmer of relief, a sense that justice could be possible even after decades of fear. The gang, once a monolithic force of control and intimidation, began to unravel rapidly. Without the mastermind coordinating operations, the enforcers lost their cohesion, the coded messages became useless, and the network's structure collapsed. Raids continued across the city, capturing members who had thought themselves untouchable. The carefully constructed system of fear that had maintained the gang's empire for years was falling apart, and the ripple effects reached every neighborhood they had controlled. Even so, investigators knew that remnants of the gang could still exist. Some members had escaped, blending back into communities aware of the consequences but confident they could remain hidden. The rape mafia's influence had been vast, and while the central structure was dismantled, fragments of its operations might linger waiting for opportunity. The city remained vigilant, and law enforcement continued monitoring for any sign of resurgence. The arrests and dismantling of the gang marked more than just a victory for law enforcement. It symbolized the power of courage and perseverance. The insider who had risked everything, the detectives who painstakingly pieced together the network, and the victims who finally spoke out, had collectively shattered decades of silence. The fall of the empire sent a clear message: even the most carefully hidden networks of fear can be exposed and brought to justice. For Merseyside, the events were transformative. Streets once avoided after dark became safer. People began reclaiming public spaces without fear. The city had been scarred, but it was beginning to heal. The rape mafia's dark empire had thrived on silence, but the bravery of a few had proven stronger than years of intimidation. Justice had finally prevailed, and the lessons of the gang's rise and fall would echo for years, reminding the city that fear can only persist when people remain quiet, and that courage, even in the smallest acts, can change everything.